When you picture World War II, what comes to mind? Is it the snowy fields of Russia, the beaches of Normandy, or the volcanic islands of the Pacific? It's a story we think we know, dominated by figures like Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. But what if I told you this picture is profoundly incomplete? What if I told you the largest volunteer army in history came from India, that the first major Allied victory of the war was won in Africa by African and Indian soldiers, and that the atomic bomb was built using uranium secretly shipped from a mine in the Congo? Welcome to 10-Minute History. I'm your host, Jake Sullivan, and today we're uncovering the forgotten story of the Global South in World War II, a story of how the overlooked and colonized nations didn't just participate in the war, but decisively shaped its outcome and their own futures. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, the Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, committed nearly 400 million people to the conflict without consulting a single one of them. This single act of imperial power kicked off one of the most complex chapters of the war. While Indian political leaders were furious, the British war machine turned to its most reliable asset, the Indian Army. From a force of just under 200,000 men, it swelled to over 2.5 million by 1945, becoming the largest all-volunteer army in the history of warfare. For many impoverished villagers, the Army's promise of a steady salary and regular meals was a powerful incentive. These men would go on to fight and distinguish themselves in every major theater of the war. Indian divisions were the backbone of the early British forces in North Africa, playing a key role in victories against the Italians and later in the desperate, bloody fighting that halted Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein. At the same time, they spearheaded the campaign in East Africa. At the brutal Battle of Keren in 1941, Indian soldiers scaled sheer mountain cliffs under heavy fire to break a supposedly impregnable Italian fortress, delivering the Allies their first major strategic victory of the war and liberating Ethiopia. They fought a grueling campaign up the spine of Italy, proving invaluable in mountain warfare at infamous battles like Monte Cassino. But nowhere was their contribution more central or more costly than in the defense of India itself. The Burma campaign was fought in a nightmarish landscape of jungle, mountains, and monsoon. After an initial disastrous retreat in 1942, the defense of India fell to the newly formed 14th Army, commanded by the brilliant General Bill Slim. The vast majority of his fighting troops were Indian. The turning point came in 1944 at the battles of Imphal and Kohima. Encircled and supplied entirely by air, Allied forces, mostly Indian, held off a ferocious Japanese offensive designed to invade India. The fighting was savage. At Kohima, the battle line ran directly across a tennis court, with soldiers lobbing grenades at each other over the net. The successful defense of Imphal and Kohima was the greatest land defeat in Japanese history, and it was inflicted primarily by the Indian Army. But the story of Indians in the war has a complicated twist. While millions fought for the Allies, some fought against them. This was the Indian National Army, or INA, led by the radical nationalist Subhas Chandra Bose. Bose believed only armed struggle could free India, and famously declared, "Give me blood and I shall give you freedom." He allied with the Axis powers, forming the INA from Indian prisoners of war captured by the Japanese. The INA fought alongside the Japanese in the invasion of Burma, but their military impact was limited. Their true significance came after the war. When the British put INA officers on trial for treason, it backfired spectacularly. The men were hailed as patriots across India, sparking mass protests and even mutinies in the British Indian Navy. The trials proved that Britain could no longer rely on the loyalty of its Indian forces, the very pillar of its rule. Back on the home front, India was transformed into a massive economic engine for the Allies, producing everything from uniforms to artillery shells. But this came at a terrible cost. Wartime policies, coupled with the loss of rice imports from Japanese-occupied Burma and a catastrophic failure of governance by the British, led to the Bengal famine of 1943. It was a man-made disaster that killed an estimated 2 to 3 million people. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who held prejudiced views of Indians, was slow to react, and the tragedy left a deep scar of bitterness, becoming a powerful indictment of colonial rule. Politically, the war created an impossible contradiction. In 1942, Mahatma Gandhi launched the Quit India movement, a mass campaign demanding immediate British withdrawal. The British responded brutally, imprisoning the entire leadership of the Indian National Congress and killing thousands of protesters. Britain was fighting a war for freedom in Europe while using machine guns to deny it in India. By 1945, the empire was bankrupt and its moral authority was shattered. The war fought to preserve the empire had become the instrument of its demise. Like India, the African continent was not on the periphery of the war, but was a central battlefield and a vital source of soldiers and resources. The desert coastline of North Africa was strategically vital, controlling the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal. While we remember the duel between Montgomery and Rommel, their armies were deeply multinational. The British Eighth Army relied heavily on Indian, South African, Australian, and New Zealand troops. And French North African soldiers, the tirailleurs and goumiers, played a significant role. The pivotal moment was Operation Torch in November 1942, the Allied invasion of Morocco and Algeria. This massive landing secured a launching pad for the invasion of Italy and was a major turning point of the war, a victory won on African soil. Further south, the campaign in East Africa saw the Allies dismantle Mussolini's empire. This victory was delivered by a truly global army of Indian divisions. British-led African soldiers from the King's African Rifles and the Royal West African Frontier Force, and Ethiopian Patriot fighters. The liberation of Ethiopia and the restoration of Emperor Haile Selassie was a huge symbolic blow against fascism. But perhaps Africa's most critical contribution was economic and strategic, and it began with a courageous decision. In 1940, after France fell, a black governor from French Guiana named Félix Ebou declared his colony, Chad, for General de Gaulle's Free French movement. This act gave de Gaulle a territorial base and an army, saving his movement from collapse. West and Central Africa then became an indispensable rear base. With Southeast Asia lost to Japan, the Allies depended on Africa for resources. Nigeria supplied tin and palm oil. The Gold Coast provided manganese for steel. And then there was the Belgian Congo. The Shinkolobwe mine in Katanga was the world's richest source of uranium. With incredible foresight, the mine's director secretly shipped his entire stock of over 1,200 tons of uranium ore to a warehouse in New York to keep it out of German hands. When the Manhattan Project began its frantic search for uranium to build an atomic bomb, they discovered this hidden stockpile. The atomic age began in a Central African mine, worked by African laborers. Over 1 million African men, often called Askaris, were mobilized to fight. The 81st and 82nd West Africa Divisions, made of Nigerian and Gold Coast soldiers, proved to be superb jungle fighters in the brutal Burma campaign. But their experience was transformative in another way. They fought alongside white soldiers, saw them bleed and die, and realized the myth of European invincibility was just that, a myth. They were also fighting for freedom and democracy while being subjected to racial discrimination in the army, receiving lower pay, and being barred from becoming officers. This hypocrisy was not lost on them. When these politically awakened veterans returned home, often to broken promises of jobs and pensions, they became the core of the nationalist movements that would win Africa's independence. While most of the world was far from the battlefields, Latin America was drawn into the war through economics and strategy. Initially, most nations were neutral, but President Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy used diplomacy and economic incentives to build an anti-Axis bloc. The final push came after Pearl Harbor and a series of German U-boat attacks on Latin American shipping. Brazil, the region's largest nation, played the most critical role. After German U-boats sank Brazilian merchant ships, massive public outrage forced President Getulio Vargas to declare war. Brazil's northeastern coast became the linchpin of the South Atlantic. The Nuttall-Dakar air bridge was a vital ferry route for flying thousands of U.S.-built aircraft to the battlefronts in Africa and Asia. Most remarkably, Brazil sent a 25,000-strong combat division to fight in Europe. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force, or FEB, was initially mocked at home with a saying that it was more likely for a snake to smoke a pipe than for the troops to see combat. So, when they deployed to the brutal mountain warfare of Italy, they proudly wore a shoulder patch of a snake smoking a pipe. Their motto became "A cobra fumu," the snake smoked. They fought with distinction, capturing the key German position of Monte Castello and earning the respect of their allies. Mexico also made a significant contribution. After German U-boats sank Mexican tankers in the Gulf of Mexico, the country declared war. Economically, Mexico was vital. The 1942 Bracero program brought millions of Mexican agricultural workers to the United States to fill labor shortages, feeding the Allied nations, and fundamentally reshaping the economies and migration patterns of both countries for decades to come. Mexico also sent a fighter squadron into combat. The Escuadron 201, known as the Aztec Eagles, flew combat missions against Japanese forces in the Philippines during the final months of the war, a tangible symbol of Mexico's commitment. Throughout the continent, from Bolivia's tin mines to Chile's copper pits and Venezuela's oil fields, Latin America became the essential arsenal of the Americas, supplying the raw materials that fueled the Allied victory. So what does it all mean? The Second World War was, in the truest sense, a world war. The contributions from the Global South were not just helpful, they were decisive. The war could not have been won without the 2.5 million Indian soldiers, the uranium from the Congo, the air bases in Brazil, or the resources from across Latin America. But the war's most profound legacy was one its instigators never intended. It was a crucible that, while inflicting immense suffering, acted as an unwitting agent of liberation. It shattered the myth of European invincibility. It exposed the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom while upholding colonial oppression. And it left the old empires of Britain and France bankrupt and exhausted, unable and unwilling to hold on to their colonies by force. The war didn't give these nations their freedom, but it created the conditions in which they could seize it for themselves, setting off the great wave of decolonization that would reshape our world. So what are your thoughts on this forgotten chapter of World War II? Let us know down in the comments below. If you found this interesting or learned something new, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to 10-Minute History for more deep dives. Thanks for listening.